The drive from Columbus to Granville took just under an hour, but it felt longer. Maybe it was the weight of expectation, or the fact that I hadn't seen my grandfather in nearly 2 years. The highway stretched ahead of me, flanked by cornfields that had already been harvested, leaving behind neat rows of stubble under the October sky. The radio played something forgettable, classic rock that blended into the hum of my Honda's engine. I'd been meaning to visit. That's what I told myself every time Mom called to ask if I'd seen him. Soon, I'd say, "Work's been crazy." And it had been, in the way that life in your late 20s becomes an endless cycle of meetings, deadlines, and trying to prove you deserve the salary they're paying you. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I didn't know what to say to him anymore. Grandpa lived in the same house he'd owned for 40 years, a modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street with white siding that had yellowed slightly with age, and a porch that sagged just enough to notice. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular way. Small Ohio towns are quiet, not silent, but hushed, as if everyone had agreed to speak a little softer. His Buick sat in the driveway, the same burgundy sedan he'd driven since before I was born, now wearing its age in rust spots along the wheel wells. I parked behind it and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the living room window I could see the blue flicker of a television. The yard needed raking, leaves had gathered in copper drifts against the foundation, and the gutters sagged with more. I made a mental note to offer to help with that. The doorbell didn't work, it hadn't in years, so I knocked and waited. From inside I heard movement, slow and deliberate, then the click of the deadbolt. The door opened to reveal my grandfather, thinner than I remembered, his flannel shirt hanging loose on his frame. His face, weathered and lined, broke into a smile that made my chest tighten with guilt. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, his voice carrying that slight rasp of age. "Come here, boy." His hug was firm despite his frame, and he smelled like Old Spice and coffee, exactly as I remembered. When we pulled apart, his eyes studied me with that particular intensity old people develop, the kind that sees through polite answers. "You look tired," he said. "Long drive," I lied. He nodded, unconvinced, and stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled like my childhood, wood polish, old books, and something faintly medicinal I couldn't quite place. The living room was exactly as I remembered it, the same brown leather recliner facing the TV, the same bookshelf crammed with paperback westerns and Tom Clancy novels, the same framed photos on the mantel documenting decades of family gatherings. But there was something new. In the corner by the window, where afternoon light pooled golden on the hardwood floor, sat a large bird cage. It was ornate, probably an antique, with brass fixtures that had tarnished to a dull green. Inside, perched on a wooden dowel, was a canary. Not the bright yellow you'd expect, but a more muted color, like butter left too long in the sun. "When did you get a bird?" I asked. Grandpa followed my gaze. "About 6 months ago. Found him at an estate sale over in Newark. Previous owner passed and nobody wanted him." He walked over to the cage, his slippers shuffling on the floor. Seemed wrong to leave him there. The bird watched us with one dark eye, its head cocked slightly. It didn't move, didn't sing, just observed with that peculiar stillness birds have when they're deciding whether you're a threat. "What's his name?" "Never gave him one," Grandpa said. "Didn't seem to need one." I walked closer, and that's when I noticed the cage door was open, not just unlocked, fully open, swung wide on its small brass hinges. The bird could have flown out at any moment. But it sat there, perfectly still, as if the open door didn't exist. "The door's open," I said, stupidly. "Yep. Why doesn't he fly out?" Grandpa was quiet for a moment, looking at the bird with an expression I couldn't quite read. "He could if he wanted to. I open it every morning. Been doing it for months now." He paused, then added almost to himself, "But he never does." There was something unsettling about it. Something that nagged at the edges of my mind in a way I couldn't articulate. A bird that wouldn't leave its cage, even when the door stood open. It felt like a riddle, or maybe a warning. Maybe he's comfortable, I offered. Maybe, Grandpa said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the easy rhythm of family visits. He made coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in the way he'd always made it, and we sat at the kitchen table while he asked about my job, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone. I gave him the sanitized versions of the truth. Work was fine, the apartment was good, I was playing the field. He listened and nodded, asking follow-up questions that were gentle but probing, the way he used to when I was a kid and had done something I didn't want to talk about. The kitchen was warm and cluttered in the way old people's kitchens are, every surface holding some artifact of daily life. Bills stacked by the toaster, a coffee mug holding pens, a wall calendar from the local bank still showing August. Outside the window above the sink, the backyard stretched away to a line of trees that had gone orange and red with the season. But my attention kept drifting back to the living room, to the cage in the corner and the bird that wouldn't fly. As evening approached and the light began to fade, Grandpa got up to start dinner, just spaghetti and store-bought sauce, nothing fancy. I offered to help, and he put me on garlic bread duty, which meant buttering sliced Italian bread and sprinkling it with garlic salt. We worked in companionable silence, the kind you can only have with family, punctuated by the sound of water boiling and the crackle of bread under the broiler. "You can stay in your old room," he said as he stirred the sauce. "Sheets are clean. Changed them this morning when your mother called to say you were coming." "Thanks, Grandpa." "How long can you stay?" "I took the week off." He glanced at me, surprised. "The whole week?" "Yeah, I hadn't planned to. I'd initially told my boss I'd be gone for the weekend, but something made me send another email before I left, asking for the full week. Maybe it was the guilt, or maybe I just needed to be away from the city for a while." "Good," Grandpa said simply. "Be nice to have the company." We ate at the small dining table, the TV playing the evening news at low volume in the other room. Grandpa asked about my apartment, and I described it. A one-bedroom in the short north, expensive but convenient, with neighbors I never talked to and walls thin enough to hear their arguments. He told me about Mrs. Henderson next door, who'd had hip surgery in June, and the new family that moved in across the street with 2 young kids who played basketball in the driveway until dark. It was ordinary conversation, the kind that fills space without saying much. But underneath it, I felt something else, something heavy and unspoken that had to do with the bird in the corner and the question I hadn't asked yet. After dinner, we washed dishes together, him washing, me drying, and then settled into the living room. Grandpa took his recliner, and I sat on the couch, the one that had been there so long it had molded itself to the shape of everyone who'd ever sat on it. The evening news had given way to jeopardy, and we watched in comfortable silence, occasionally calling out answers. But I kept looking at the cage. The bird hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. It just sat there, facing the window where the last light was draining from the sky. The cage door remained open, an invitation or maybe a test, and the bird ignored it completely. During a commercial break, I asked, "Has he ever tried to leave?" "Even once?" Grandpa lowered the volume on the remote. "Not that I've seen. That's strange, isn't it?" "I suppose. I mean, he's a bird. Flying is what they do." My grandfather looked at the cage, then at me, his expression thoughtful. "You'd think so, wouldn't you?" "But maybe it's more complicated than that. How so?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Then he said, "When I was in Korea, this was 1952, I was just a kid really. We had this sergeant, tough guy from Pittsburgh. He got taken prisoner for about 3 months before we got him back." Grandpa paused, his eyes distant. After he came home, they offered to send him stateside, give him an easy assignment to finish out his service, but he refused. Wanted to stay right where he was, even though it was dangerous, even though he'd been through hell. Why? We asked him that. "And you know what he said?" Grandpa looked at me. He said, "BT, because I know this cage." Well, that's the word he used. Cage. He said at least he understood the dangers here, knew what to expect. Going home, starting over, that scared him more than staying in a war zone. The story hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't quite ready to examine. "That's different, though," I said. "That's a person making a choice. The bird doesn't understand." "It's just an animal." "Maybe," Grandpa said. "Or maybe animals understand more than we give them credit for." He turned the volume back up, and we returned to watching the show. But my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about the sergeant from Pittsburgh, about choosing the familiar pain over the unknown, about sitting in a cage with the door open because at least you knew where the walls were. That night, lying in my old bedroom with its faded baseball posters and the twin bed that felt too small for my adult frame, I couldn't sleep. Through the thin walls I could hear the house settling, the ancient furnace kicking on and off, my grandfather's occasional cough from down the hall. And underneath it all I imagined I could hear the bird, though it made no sound. I thought about my life in Columbus, my apartment that never felt like home, my job that paid well but left me feeling hollow, the dates I went on that never led anywhere because I couldn't seem to let anyone get close. I thought about all the times I'd said soon to my mother about visiting, all the times I'd let calls from old friends go to voicemail, all the ways I'd carefully constructed a life that looked fine from the outside but felt increasingly like a cage, and the door was open. It had always been open. I could change jobs, move cities, reach out to people I'd lost touch with. Nothing was actually stopping me except my own inertia, my own fear of the unknown, my own comfort with the familiar dimensions of my unhappiness. But that was dramatic, I told myself, turning over in bed. I wasn't unhappy. I was just tired, and it was late. And I was overthinking things the way I always did. Still, as I finally drifted off to sleep, I kept seeing the bird in my mind, silent still, staring at a sky it could reach but wouldn't try for. Morning came slowly in Granville, announced not by alarm clocks but by the gradual accumulation of small sounds, birds in the trees outside, a car starting somewhere down the street, the gentle creak of old floorboards as my grandfather moved around downstairs. I woke to pale sunlight filtering through the curtains and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. When I came downstairs, still in the sweatpants and t-shirt I'd slept in, I found Grandpa at the kitchen table with his coffee and the Newark Advocate spread out before him. He was wearing his reading glasses low on his nose, frowning at the obituaries the way he always did, checking if he recognized any names. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Coffee's fresh." "Mugs are where they've always been." I poured myself a cup from the ancient Mr. Coffee on the counter and joined him at the table. Through the doorway, I could see into the living room and the bird in its cage. Even from here, I could tell the door was open again. "You already opened it?" I asked. "Every morning," Grandpa confirmed. "Part of the routine." "And he still hasn't flown out?" "Nope." I sipped my coffee and watched the bird. It was preening now, running its beak through its feathers with meticulous care, completely unconcerned with the open door, just inches away. Something about the scene bothered me more than it should have. "Doesn't that worry you?" I asked. "That something's wrong with him?" "Took him to the vet a few months back," Grandpa said, turning a page of the newspaper. "Clean bill of health. She said some birds just get institutionalized, spend so much time in captivity that they forget how to want freedom." "That's depressing, is it?" He looked at me over his glasses. "Or is it just honest?" We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the rustle of newspaper pages and the distant bark of a dog. Outside the morning was crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes you remember why people love fall. Cool enough for a jacket, warm enough in the sun, the air carrying that particular scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace. "What do you want to do today?" Grandpa asked, folding the paper. "I don't know." "What do you usually do?" "Not much. Grocery shopping on Tuesdays. But that's about it." "We could go somewhere," I suggested. Get lunch in town. I haven't been to Granville in years. He considered this. All right, let me get dressed. An hour later, we were walking down Broadway, the main street that runs through the center of Granville. The town was picture-perfect in that way. Small Ohio villages try to be. Brick buildings from the 1800s housing coffee shops and antique stores. The old Granville Inn sitting stately on its hill. Denison University students walking in small groups toward campus. It was nothing like Columbus, where everything moved faster, where you could be surrounded by thousands of people and still feel completely alone. Here, Grandpa knew everyone. We couldn't walk 20 feet without someone stopping to say hello, the woman at the hardware store asking about his hip, the man at the bank mentioning they needed to set up a golf game before it got too cold, the waitress at the coffee shop who didn't ask for his order because she already knew it. We settled into a booth at Witt's Frozen Custard, even though it was barely 10:30. Grandpa ordered his usual, a turtle sundae, and I got a coffee custard, and we sat by the window watching people pass by on the sidewalk. You know all these people, I observed. Most of them. Small town. Hard not to. Do you like that? He considered the question seriously. Sometimes. Sometimes it's nice to be known. Sometimes it's suffocating. When your grandmother passed, people were kind, but... He paused, stirring his custard. But sometimes you want to grieve alone, and in a place like this, they don't let you. Everyone wants to help, wants to check on you, wants to make sure you're eating enough. It comes from love, but it can feel like pressure. I thought about my apartment building, where I didn't know any of my neighbors' names, where we avoided eye contact in the elevator. I guess I have the opposite problem. Nobody knows me at all? Is that what you want? I don't know, I admitted. Sometimes I think it is. It's easier, you know? No expectations. No one to disappoint? Grandpa looked at me with that searching expression again. Who are you afraid of disappointing? The question landed heavier than it should have. I tried to laugh it off. That's pretty deep for a Wednesday morning. I'm old. I'm allowed to be deep. We finished our custard and continued walking. Past the library with its white columns, past the elementary school where my mother had gone, past the Presbyterian church with its tall spire visible from anywhere in town. Grandpa moved slowly but steadily, occasionally stopping to rest on a bench and comment on how things had changed. The bookstore that used to be a pharmacy, the parking lot that used to be someone's house, the endless small evolutions that mark time in a place that seems to stay the same. We had lunch at the Granville Inn, sitting in the dining room with its dark wood paneling and white tablecloths. I ordered a club sandwich, and Grandpa got the meatloaf, which he said had been on the menu for 40 years. The waitress called him by name and asked about me, and he introduced me with obvious pride, telling her about my job in Columbus, inflating its importance the way grandparents do. After lunch, we drove to the grocery store, a Kroger on the edge of town that seemed enormous compared to the small market that had been there when I was a kid. Grandpa pushed the cart slowly up and down the aisles, consulting a list written in his careful handwriting, and I followed behind, occasionally grabbing things he couldn't reach on high shelves. It was deeply, profoundly ordinary, and yet, watching him compare prices on cans of tomato soup, seeing the careful way he selected produce, noting how long he stood in front of the cereal aisle, deciding between brands, I felt a peculiar ache. This was his life now, this routine, these small decisions, the quiet rhythm of days that all looked essentially the same. "Do you get lonely?" I asked, as we loaded bags into the trunk of his Buick. He didn't answer right away, just closed the trunk and slowly made his way to the driver's side. When we were both inside, engine running but car still in park, he said, "Sometimes. Your grandmother and I were married for 53 years. You get used to having someone there, someone to talk to, even if you're just complaining about the weather or wondering what's for dinner. The silence is the hardest part. I'm sorry I don't visit more. You're here now," he said simply and put the car in drive. Back at the house, we put away groceries and fell into an easy afternoon rhythm. Grandpa dozed in his recliner while I sat on the couch with a book I'd found on his shelf, some western about cowboys and cattle drives.
but I couldn't concentrate on it.
My eyes kept drifting to the bird. It had moved since morning. Now it was on a different perch, closer to the water dish, but it still hadn't ventured toward the open door. I watched it for a long time, trying to understand. The cage wasn't even that nice. It was clean but old, the bars showing wear. And outside the window, just beyond the glass, trees swayed in the afternoon breeze. Birds flew past, sparrows and finches and what might have been a cardinal. The canary could see them. It had to know it was the same species, that it belonged out there with them. But it stayed. I thought about calling someone, my mother maybe, or my friend Jake, back in Columbus.
But I didn't know what I'd say. Hey, I'm at Grandpa's, and he has this bird that won't leave its cage even though the door's open.
And for some reason it's really messing with me. They'd think I'd lost it. Maybe I had. That evening, after another simple dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that tasted like childhood, we sat on the porch, even though it was getting cold. Grandpa had his jacket on, and I'd borrowed one of his, and we sat in the wicker chairs that had been there forever, watching the street as the sun set and porch lights began to flicker on up and down the block. Mrs. Henderson came out to get her mail and we waved to her. A teenager rode past on a bicycle. Somewhere a dog barked. It was the kind of evening that happens thousands of times in thousands of small towns, unremarkable and yet somehow perfect in its ordinariness. "Can I ask you something?"
I said finally. Of course. Why do you keep opening the cage door if you know he won't fly out?
Grandpa rocked slowly in his chair, considering.
I hope, I suppose.
Maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe he'll surprise me. But he never does. Not yet. Doesn't that make you sad? He was quiet for a long time, watching as the streetlights came on, their sodium glow turning the twilight orange. Sometimes, he admitted, but I keep thinking about that sergeant from Korea, the one I told you about. If someone had just given up on him, accepted that he was too damaged to change, where would he be? Sometimes keeping the door open is all you can do. The rest is up to them. Did he ever make it home?
I asked at the sergeant.
Eventually. Took a few more years, but he did. Got married, had kids, worked at a steel mill for 30 years.
I got a Christmas card from him every year until he died about a decade ago. Grandpa smiled slightly.
In one of his letters, he thanked me for not judging him, for not treating him like he was broken. Said that made all the difference. But you did think he was broken. I thought he was hurt, Grandpa corrected. There's a difference. Broken means it can't be fixed. Hurt means it needs time to heal. We sat until it got too cold to sit anymore, then went inside. The house was warm, and the bird was settling in for the night, its head tucked slightly into its feathers. The cage door remained open, a constant invitation into the darkness beyond. Before bed, I stood in front of the cage for a long time, just watching. The bird watched me back, its eye dark and knowing in a way that unsettled me. What did it see when it looked at me?
Another prisoner? Another creature that couldn't figure out how to leave?
"You can fly," I whispered to it. "You know that, right? The door is right there." You could be free. The bird didn't move, didn't react. It just looked at me with that same calm, knowing expression, as if it understood something I didn't. That night, lying in my too small bed, I scrolled through my phone, Instagram posts from people I barely knew, LinkedIn updates from colleagues I didn't like, text messages I'd been ignoring. My life reduced to notifications. I thought about replying to some of them, about reaching out,
about trying to bridge the distance I'd let grow between myself and everyone else. But I didn't. Instead,
I turned off my phone and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me, and tried not to think about how long it had been since I'd felt truly free. The days began to blur together in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I fell into Grandpa's routine without meaning to, waking with the sunlight, coffee at the kitchen table, the morning ritual of him opening the cage door while I watched from the couch. The bird never moved toward freedom, and Grandpa never acknowledged the disappointment. It was Thursday, or maybe Friday. I'd lost track. When I woke up at 3 a.m, my heart racing for no reason I could name. The house was silent, except for the furnace and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I lay there, staring at shadows on the ceiling, and felt the weight of something I'd been avoiding settle on my chest. I got up and went downstairs quietly, careful not to wake my grandfather. The living room was dark except for the streetlight glow coming through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and grey. The bird was asleep in its cage, a small, still lump of feathers. The door, predictably, was closed. Grandpa shut it at night, he'd explained, because it felt wrong to leave it open in the dark. I sat on the couch in my sweatpants and t-shirt, cold despite the heated house, and let myself think about the things I'd been running from. Her name was Sarah, and we dated for 2 years. She'd wanted to get married, wanted to move in together at least, wanted to talk about the future in concrete terms, and I'd said yes to all of it, had agreed to everything she wanted, while simultaneously doing nothing to make any of it happen. I'd drag my feet on apartment hunting, find excuses to postpone meeting with the jeweler, change the subject whenever she brought up timelines, and she'd finally called me on it. Not in a fight, not in anger, but in a quiet conversation in her apartment with the lights of Columbus spread out below us. "You don't actually want this," she'd said. "You want it, which isn't the same thing." "That's not true," I'd protested. "Then why do you flinch every time I mention the future?"
I didn't have an answer.
Or rather, I had several answers that all contradicted each other, and none of them were honest enough to say out loud. She'd ended it that night, kindly but firmly, and I'd felt simultaneously devastated and relieved. The relief had made me hate myself, which I'd dealt with by throwing myself into work and avoiding any situation that might lead to real emotional intimacy. That was 2 years ago. I hadn't dated anyone seriously since. Sitting there in my grandfather's living room, watching the sleeping bird, I finally let myself understand why. It wasn't that I didn't want love or connection. It wasn't that Sarah hadn't been right for me. She had been, in almost every way. It was that I was terrified of being truly known, truly seen, because if someone got that close, they'd see all the ways I was insufficient. They'd see that I hated my job but was too afraid of failure to try something else. They'd see that I had dreams I'd given up on. I'd wanted to be a writer once, in college, had filled notebooks with stories and ideas before deciding it was impractical and getting a marketing degree instead. They'd see that I was lonely but unwilling to be vulnerable, that I kept everyone at arm's length and then wondered why I felt isolated. They'd see the cage I'd built for myself, bar by bar, excuse by excuse, until I was so comfortable in its familiar dimensions that freedom seemed more terrifying than confinement. The bird shifted slightly in its sleep, and I envied it. At least it had the excuse of being an animal, of operating on instinct rather than conscious choice.
What was my excuse? I must have dozed off on the couch because I woke to grey dawn light and my grandfather standing over me with a cup of coffee. "You okay?"
he asked, handing me the mug. "Yeah, couldn't sleep?" He nodded and didn't push, which I appreciated. He moved to the bird cage and opened the door with his usual slow deliberation, and I watched the bird wake up, stretch its wings once, a brief, tantalizing motion, and then settle back onto its perch. "Can I ask you something?"
I said. "Already told you yes once." "How did you know Grandma was the one?"
He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that comes from good memories.
"I didn't at first."
"We met at a dance at the Legion Hall. I was home on leave, and she was there with her girlfriends.
I asked her to dance because she looked like the kind of girl who'd say yes, and she did."
After making me sweat for a minute, he sat down in his recliner, cradling his own coffee. "We dated while I was stationed in Ohio, and when I got sent to Korea, we wrote letters. Lots of letters, and somewhere in those letters, I realized I was telling her things I'd never told anyone. Not because she asked, but because it felt natural. Like I could be completely honest with her and she wouldn't judge me for it. That sounds nice. It was terrifying, he corrected. Being that vulnerable with someone? I'd grown up in a time and place where men didn't talk about their feelings, didn't admit to being scared or uncertain. But with her I could.
And when I came home, she knew me, really knew me, and wanted me anyway. That's when I knew. Did you ever regret it?
Getting married? Sometimes, he admitted. Not the marriage, but the commitment. There were moments over 53 years when I wondered what my life would have been like if I'd stayed single, if I'd traveled more, if I'd been free to do whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. But those moments passed because the reality of what I had was better than any fantasy of what I'd given up. He sipped his coffee, looking at the bird. Freedom is overrated sometimes. What matters is choosing what you give your freedom up for. We had breakfast, eggs and toast, more coffee. And then Grandpa suggested we drive out to Dawes Arboretum, about 20 minutes away.
Haven't been in a while, he said.
Trees should be pretty this time of year. The Arboretum was nearly empty on a weekday morning, just us and a few other people walking the trails that wound through hundreds of acres of carefully maintained forest. The trees were at peak color, maples blazing red and orange, oaks turned bronze, the occasional yellow birch standing out like a flame. The air was crisp and smelled like earth and decay, that particular autumn scent of things breaking down to feed new growth. We walked slowly, Grandpa setting the pace, and talked about small things. The weather, the trees, a deer we saw in the distance. But eventually the conversation turned more serious. Your mother worries about you, he said as we sat on a bench overlooking a small pond. I know. She thinks you're lonely. I know that too. Are you? I watched the water where a few geese had landed and were swimming in lazy circles. Yeah, I am. Why? It was a simple question, but answering it required admitting things I'd been avoiding.
Because it's easier.
Because if I let people get close, I might disappoint them. Because I've built a life that looks fine from the outside, but feels empty, and I don't know how to change it without admitting I was wrong about everything. Grandpa nodded slowly. You sound like that bird. I guess I do. You know what I've learned? He said after a while. Pain becomes comfortable. Not because it feels good, but because it's familiar. You know its shape, its weight, its rhythms. And when you've carried pain long enough, you start to forget what life feels like without it. The thought of putting it down becomes more frightening than the thought of carrying it forever. So what do? You practice little steps. You open the door every day, even if you don't fly out. You remind yourself that the option exists. And maybe one day, you wake up and the fear of staying is finally bigger than the fear of leaving. We sat for a long time, watching the geese, and I thought about all the doors in my life that I'd been afraid to walk through. The job applications I'd never submitted because what if I wasn't good enough? The friendships I'd let atrophy because maintaining them required vulnerability. The creative pursuits I'd abandoned because doing them badly felt worse than not doing them at all. The conversation I'd been avoiding with myself about whether this was really the life I wanted. That evening, after another quiet dinner, I called Sarah. I don't know why, maybe it was everything Grandpa had been saying, or maybe I just needed to hear her voice. She answered on the third ring, sounding surprised but not upset. Hey, she said.
This is unexpected, I know. I'm sorry to bother you. You're not bothering me. Is everything okay?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I was sitting on the porch, even though it was cold enough to see my breath.
I've been thinking about things, about us.
About how I messed it up. That was 2 years ago, she said gently. We both moved on, have we?
I have. I'm engaged, actually.
We're getting married in the spring. The words shouldn't have hurt. I'd given up any right to them hurting, but they did. Congratulations, really. I'm happy for you. Thank you. She paused. Can I ask why you're really calling?
I don't know. I guess I wanted to say I'm sorry.
For not being honest with you or with myself. For wasting your time. You didn't waste my time, she said. We had good years together. They weren't a waste just because they ended. I wish I'd been braver. Then be braver now. Not for me, for yourself. We talked for a few more minutes and then said goodbye, and I sat on the porch until the cold forced me inside. When I walked through the living room, the bird was awake, standing near the front of its cage. The door had been closed for the night, but for a moment I could have sworn it looked at me with something like understanding. Later, lying in bed, I thought about what it would mean to be braver. To apply for jobs I actually wanted instead of jobs that were safe. To reach out to old friends I'd lost touch with and risk the awkwardness of reconnection. To try writing again, even badly, just to see if the spark was still there. To stop living in a cage I'd built myself. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, and I fell asleep not knowing which feeling would win.